You're listening to 106.9 Tune FM here on the home of UNE Student Powered Radio. And today in the studio, we are joined by Dr Aaron Eger from the University of New South Wales to talk about kelp forests and specifically why they need our help. So thank you so much for joining me in the studio today, Aaron.
My pleasure. Always happy to chat about kelp.
I grew up on the coast myself, so I'm very familiar with it and how important it is. But how did you get into studying kelp and marine science and your love for kelp?
I think it's a bit of a circuitous story, a bit of a windabout, but in the end of the day, I think I might just enjoy being a little bit different. I grew up on the west coast of Canada, love nature, love being outdoors, wanted to do something with my career that would help preserve the place that I love so much. Everybody was working on land and in the forest, like, I'll go work in the ocean. And then you go work in the ocean, and then everybody's working on coral reefs. Like, I'll go work on kelp forest. And then we just found this opportunity of this ecosystem that was incredibly important, really just distributed across a third of our coastlines, half of Australia, most of Canada, where I grew up, but was really forgotten in so many different aspects in policy and funding and science. And there was this opportunity to kind of start to right that ship and try to make a bit of a difference with our research and bring more attention and bring more focus to preserving and protecting this ecosystem.
And so what brought you from Canada to Australia? So the other side of the world, basically.
Yeah, again, a little bit of a jump and a hop journey. Was looking at doing a PhD and found a supervisor here who was offering kind of the opportunity to build my own program and really focus on the impact of the work and how that touched on society and importantly how we can communicate that research to people. So we just got on quite well and found the option, and remember it took like a week to kind of think about whether I wanted to come once I got accepted and move to the other side of the world, and had a few friends to chat to, and everyone's like, you can always move back to Canada. They're not going to take away your passport if you move to Australia, so just go for it and see what happens. And now we're stuck here. Yeah, the dog's here, the job's here, friends.
And now you've built something fantastic. This is a really important project, and I think a lot of people don't understand why kelp is so important. I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with it will go, it's just that stinky stuff, or it's that stuff that freaks me out when it touches my leg when I'm swimming. So what is kelp, and why does it need our help?
So kelp is a seaweed. It's a big brown seaweed. It creates really lush, diverse forests. You can think of it really quite easily as forests underwater. And so we have these kelps that will grow from anywhere kind of the height of your knee to the height of a 3-story building. And with all of that structure, we just find the fabric of our cold water seas. So kelp grows outside the tropics, across that 1/3 of our world's coastlines. And in those places, it is the foundation, it's the structure, it's the backbone of our ocean habitats, our coastal habitats. So it provides places for animals to live, it provides food for animals to eat, it captures carbon, it produces oxygen, it removes nutrient pollution from the water. We eat it ourselves, we use it in our stories, our cultures, our myths. We just like to look at it and go dive in it and experience it. And it really is, I like to think, the fabric of our cold water seas.
I mean, I've looked at videos, I've looked at some of the photos on your website, on the Kelp Forest Alliance website. It's like another world down there. It's just absolutely beautiful. And I can understand why, if for no other reason, you look at this and you want to protect it just on that. But obviously it has a lot of really, really important benefits. So what are some of the things that are actively threatening kelp forests at the moment?
Kelp are threatened generally by warming oceans, so they are cold water species, and so they're adapted to live in the colder parts of the world. But when we say cold water, we also mean relatively cold water. So, we have kelp outside of Brisbane, for instance, living at 25 degrees, or it'll get to 25 degrees here in Sydney, and the kelp will do just fine. But there is a limit to that. It can only be so adaptable. So in some places, when those temperatures get too high, often usually during a heat wave, like an extreme event that pushes kelp over that threshold that it can photosynthesize, that it can grow, it can die there. But then we also get some really interesting ecological interactions. So kelp is like a plant. So animals eat plants. And in the ocean, the main animal that eats kelp is sea urchins. And they're really voracious. They can just mow down a kelp forest in a matter of days. And what happens is, as the water gets warmer, some sea urchin species can migrate to new places because it's now warm and nice and habitable for them to grow and reproduce. Or often the thing that eats the sea urchin, people also like to eat. So, like big predatory fish or lobster. And when we take those out of the system for food, or North America, there's a really interesting story with the sea otter used for the fur trade, but that was a big predator of sea urchins. And by taking that out of the system, you lose that predator that controls the sea urchin population, and then the sea urchins just go to town. And then there's another really interesting but kind of vicious cycle where most sea urchins actually prefer to eat the dead kelp, the stuff that's kind of fluffed off and is laying on the seafloor and it's starting to decompose. It's kind of like pre-digested in a way. It's easier for them to eat. But if there's not enough live kelp to produce enough dead kelp, they'll swap and they'll spend more energy to eat the live kelp. So then there's even less kelp to produce even less dead kelp for the sea urchins to eat, and they just go down this cycle until then there's no kelp. And urchins are not complicated creatures. They're just kind of little pinballs.
Yeah.
And they don't need a lot to live. So when they need to, they can just switch off and essentially go into hibernation for years. And you just maintain this empty landscape just filled with sea urchins, and any new kelp that comes along, they can pick off quite quickly because there's thousands of them.
It's kind of like the crown of stars with the coral reefs a little bit. Those starfish that go in
Yes.
and eat everything. But you are, I don't want to get onto the coral reef thing. We came here to talk about kelp, which I think deserves just as much love. And so you are the founder and program director of the Kelp Forest Alliance, and with that, recently released a report. There's this research paper saying that we need to have an investment in order to restore and protect 4 million hectares of kelp forests, which is I'm really bad with numbers and spatial awareness. I'm assuming that's a lot of kelp. And on that, you've called for 14 billion US dollars to help for that. That is a astounding number. So how did you come up with this figure?
So kelp, as we were saying, are often forgotten forests. There's just a lack of policy resolved around helping kelp. And so one of the first things we did when we created the alliance was bring everybody together from around the world and say, what do we want the future to look like? What do we want our vision in, say, 2040 to be? How much kelp do we want to protect? How much do we want to restore? We based it off the best facts that we had available. How much kelp is there? How much has been lost? How much can we restore given current methods? And that's how we came up with this 4 million hectare target. And it also aligned quite closely with some international policy work that had been done to protect and restore 30% of our world's ecosystems in general by 2030, but we extended it to 2040. And then once we had that area-based number down, we then need to start thinking about how we actually get there. It was ambitious. We felt it was ambitious but achievable, but there were still a lot of kind of missing steps in completing that journey. And part of that's just fundraising for it and paying for it. So we had a similar kind of follow-up series of workshops where we brought people together, figured out how much it costs to restore different kinds of kelp in different places around the world, what sort of protected area maintenance costs were, and provided a range of scenarios, some extremely optimistic and some extremely pessimistic, and then came with this sort of balanced approach of achievable but ambitious to fundraise $14 billion. But that's also across 15 years, across 27 countries that have kelp forests. And so we can really share that burden and break it down. And we won't mention the coral word, but there is that amount of money available for conservation. It just needs to be directed. And in Australia, you can make a really strong argument that it really needs to be directed because 2/3 of Australians live next to a kelp forest. And some of our biggest, most important fisheries are very dependent on kelp. And so there's a strong business case to be made for reaching not just the financial target, but the area-based target.
But I mean, because there's other industries that rely on kelp as well. I know there's been some research into a new sustainable type of food for cows, which uses seaweed. I'm not sure if that's kelp specifically, but it is would be beneficial for them as well
Mm,
to sit here and go, okay, let's help restore the kelp forest. There's a lot going on there. It's all sort of intertwined.
absolutely.
Um, and so you've published the first ever kelp restoration guidebook, which I think is fantastic. What are some of the challenges to restoring kelp at the moment?
A lot of our biggest challenges faced are revolving around the fact that we need to fix why it disappeared in the first place. So if the water is too warm, or there's too many sea urchins, or there's too much pollution, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to just go plant some kelp, because it'll die for the same reason it died in the first place. So we have the guidebook as sort of the practical steps that you need to take to restore a kelp forest, and including assessing whether the environment is suitable for kelp. But then we also have the Alliance to sort of bring about the sort of change that we need to create warmer, it's not warmer, clearer waters, create a better policy climate and action, and to restore predator populations and restore that sort of balance in the ecosystem. So it's always going to be a combination of these big high level policy levers by addressing things like CO2 emissions with on the ground in the water activities like communities planting kelp or removing sea urchins as part of a fisheries initiative.
And I mean, sea urchins are edible as well, so there's
There's a
that there
lot of
as well.
opportunities. Yeah,
You
there's a
can go and
whole
yeah,
restaurant in Melbourne dedicated just to sea urchins.
that's
Ways
fantastic.
you can eat it.
And are there any countries that are doing particularly well right now when it comes to protecting and restoring kelp?
Yes, so South Korea is really leading the charge, and so we've set that million hectare target. South Korea itself has set an internal target of about 54,000 hectares. So that's about 1/20th of the goal just by itself. And they're making a lot of really good progress in their restoration campaign. They started all the way back in 2009. They have a time horizon until 2030. And I think they put about 30,000 of those hectares under restoration to date. And that shows that it's not only doable, but that it can work as well. And we've seen some really positive benefits from the restoration projects in Korea. And they just view the ocean a bit differently and kelp a bit differently, I feel, in South Korea, where they have a stronger connection to it because a lot of their food traditionally comes from the sea. And there's a bit more of this sort of marine gardening philosophy. So we'll very often in places like Canada or Australia take a kind of let's just step back approach, and we'll say leave nature alone, it can sort itself out, and we remove ourselves, we're the problem. Let's just let nature run its course. But in Korea and Japan as well, to some extent, it's more kind of hands-on, more interventionist, where they'll garden the ocean. We're taking from the sea, but we can also take care of the sea. And so they applied that philosophy to the restoration program, and have a lot more success in getting government support and buy-in and community support and buy-in for those restoration programs.
I think that's an absolutely beautiful philosophy to have, particularly for a country or a culture where you're so connected to the ocean. And while we might not have that as much in Australia for a lot of cultures, um, I'm sure it's certain for Indigenous and Aboriginal cultures that rely on the sea. We still have a very strong connection to our coastline and to our waters, regardless of where you're from. So I think that's something that can really be learned from South Korea and Japan in
Mm.
that regard. Um, one of the numbers on that I was reading, I don't remember where it was. I think it was on the Kelp Forest Alliance website. Was 300 years of kelp restoration, into like historical. So, what can we learn from not just South Korea and Japan and their marine gardening ideas, but also from indigenous cultures like in Canada or Australia or New Zealand when it comes to how they engage with the kelp forest?
I think it is shifting that sort of philosophy into a more respect, reciprocal responsibility relationship with our ocean. And the 300-year sort of history of kelp dates back to northern Japan, where because they would harvest the kelp for food, they used to pay for taxes. It was just a really important part of their society and as a commodity. So they had some early declines, and so there were sort of decrees to create new space for kelp to grow to offset this harvest that was taking place. And that's kind of one of the few places in the world that that practice occurred. You really need to then skip forward to maybe 1960 in California, where we start actually trying to actively restore kelp. So the act of restoring kelp is a relatively modern activity, but certainly the philosophy of needing to care for and have this sort of reciprocal relationship with the sea is older than we can imagine. And starting to adopt that and applying that philosophy into these sort of more modern approaches will go a long way, I think, in addressing this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything that I haven't mentioned that we haven't talked about that you'd like to add now? I know that there is a way for people to get involved with the Kelp Forest Alliance and with the funding. Anything else you'd want to add?
I would just encourage anyone listening on the southern half of Australia to go explore your local kelp forest. If you live by the coast and there's a rocky shore, there's almost certainly a kelp forest there for you to go visit. Have your own My Octopus Teacher moment, see what lives there, come back, see if that critter's still hanging out, and really try to rebuild this lost connection that we have with our ocean and take that forward with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me today, Aaron. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And I hope our listeners have learned something about this really special part of our world.
My pleasure. Happy to be here.